thanks all of you for being here. And thank you to this this terrific panel. I feel like, Jani, maybe we should do this in puppets or something.
Everything puppets.
Everything puppets.
That works.
I'll be your puppet.
So just to lay the groundwork, I wanted to ask each of you about how the conversation around appropriation has come up in your various fields. So, Jani, I want to start with you. In theater and in the arts, can you describe how the conversation has been happening around the question of Indigenous appropriation in that arena?
You bet. So I'd like to go back a little bit if I can, and you can cut me off anytime because I can just go on and on.
We've got an hour. We've got so much time.
So I was doing some research for an upcoming production play I'm calling Prophecy Fog, and what I have to read this off the page just to prove that I don't make this up. So I think cultural appropriation is at the seed and the heart of it is this idea of assumption of superiority. It has branched out into many other things, but I think at the seed of it, it is an assumption of superiority. And it's also connected from the research that I've done to the idea of creating a distinct American and Canadian identity separate to that of a European identity. So, for example, in where is it? I didn't put the date. Around the mid-1800s, late 1800s in the United States of America, there was, and we had Canadians, similar organization, was the creation of the International Order of the Red Man. So this organization was actually open to white men only. And I just want to read this for you because the Improved Order of the Red Man was a secret society where white men could dress up like Indians to help them cope with their disjointed sense of American identity. So when I first read this, I thought, well, so anyway, there is a Wikipedia page, so I'm not making this up. The complication with that, of course, and the Tamarack Society as well, which some of you may or may not know, also mainly in the United States, but at the turn of the century, late 1800s, early 1900s, the Tamarack Society would do Indigenous ceremonies. These were all white males. They would do Indigenous ceremonies to welcome immigrants to the United States of America and to Canada. And it was under, again, this guise of creating a distinct American identity. And in order to do that, they borrowed from Indigenous people. This also transpired into not only a theatrical practice, but also was very embedded in music. So at the turn of the century, Dvorak came, and he was the artistic director of the American Composers Society in New York City. And he encouraged American composers, mainly white males, to record or ask music ethnologists to record Indigenous music and black music, and then to use that music to help create a musical identity that was distinctly American and Canadian. So for me, the root of it is also in that. How that's transpired then into, and the branches of that tree or from that seed are quite extensive. But to me, it started with an assumption of superiority, that it was okay to do that without permission. And then B, to create a new sense of self that and identity that was distinct from their European counterparts. Mm-hmm.
And when you first started your career in theater, do you recall the first time that you came across this kind of, the appropriation or a storytelling where someone was telling somebody else's story or using someone else's tradition in that kind of way?
When we, I was part of a Native women's theater group called sorry, it's not what it was called, Turtle Gals Performance Ensemble, and we were researching Indigenous performers from the turn of the century because we were curious if there were any. And much to our surprise, there were hundreds and thousands of them, actually, primarily in music, in silent film. There was a woman named Princess Redwing who, along with her husband James Red Deer, had their own production company. They wrote, produced, starred in silent films. That changed, of course, when the talkies came in because we didn't speak in a dialect and a language that was acceptable for an American film identity. And so these hundreds of Indigenous performers at the turn of the century lost their ability to tell their own stories as a result of A, the expectation of white audience, and B, the introduction of the talkie in film and television. And it was then that the real crack started to happen in terms of us losing control of our ability to tell our own stories in a theatrical and a film-based media or screen-based media format. And in music, it was also complicated because, again, primarily expectation of white audience in terms of the demand that was made for and the expectation of what was acceptable and what was expected to be heard.
Yeah. James, I'll bring you in here. You know, Jani's talked a bit about the history within film. So I'm wondering if you could talk about you know, Canadian film and documentary in particular. Where have the fault lines been around this question of appropriation, and who has the right to tell which story and whose story?
Well, I, you know, have no difficulty self-identifying as a settler. I am a settler, and this is a settler state, and one that was dedicated for at least the first 100 years of its existence to the aggressive civilization or assimilation of Indigenous people. That was primary business of Canada. It pains me to say that perhaps until the last half century, and maybe not even the last 25 years, Canadian journalists and filmmakers have generally failed to tell that story. I think that is changing, and we've had some very important teachers in the documentary community. Certainly, those of us of my generation have come up, have benefited from the work of people like Anishinaabe and Gil Cardinal, Willie Dunn, just to mention three brilliant Indigenous filmmakers. And I've had the honor of working with two of them. And one of them, Gil Cardinal, became a very close friend. And we made films together for close to a decade. So I see, in the course of my career, which is now stretched over 2 millennia, so 25 to 30 years approximately. The problem primarily was one of access, absolutely one of access. But I think it's also important to realize that a woman like Alanis was making fantastic films in the 1970s, and they were finding an audience, so we shouldn't forget that. But access was clearly a problem, and I would suggest, as someone who spent 10 years at the national broadcaster, what I consider, as a former journalism educator, to be a misinterpretation of the Broadcast Act, in which the only objectivity is a kind of consumerist, middle-class, privileged objectivity, which is no objectivity at all. Everything else is considered to be biased. I certainly saw the painful experience of a number of Indigenous colleagues around the country. Less so now, but certainly frequently in the 1980s and 90s. Their stories were rejected simply because it was assumed theirs would be biased, because they would simply be telling the stories of which they would have knowledge and very, very legitimate reasons to tell. I think things are improving. I was, how many people have seen Angry Inuk? Alethea Anakuk Barria's brilliant polemical documentary. She gave a keynote address at the TIFF Doc conference just last September. And she certainly, with wonderful eloquence, defended the Indigenous voice and the need for more Indigenous voices across the board in Canadian media, including documentary. She also talked about the importance of collaboration. And she talked about her colleagues, non-Indigenous filmmakers in Montreal, who were critical to the making of Angry Anouk. And as some of you may know, the film that's just about to be released that had its world premiere at TIFF, The Grizzlies, which is a feature film, is produced by Althea and directed by a non-Indigenous woman, Miranda Pontier. I saw it last night. I think we're all in the same canoe. My community, Italian, Canadian, English Canadian, obviously has not suffered the trauma that we settlers have visited on Indigenous people. But here we are in the 21st century. I brought a prop.
Okay.
Calls to action, national.
Okay, before we get too far into it, I want to bring Duncan in just so we can get sort of the kind of the full lay of the land, and then we'll get it. We'll dig more into the issues. So, Duncan, can you talk a bit about the shape of the conversations around appropriation within journalism?
So I have 3 words for you.
Okay.
Cultural Appropriation Prize. For those of you in the audience who don't know, last year there was something that was jokingly referred to as the Cultural Appropriation Prize, which came up on Twitter. And I say jokingly because I think the people that were suggesting it thought they were making a joke. Unfortunately, many of them were senior journalists and broadcasters in the Canadian media landscape, and I don't think that they recognized that it wasn't a joke what they were talking about, not at all. And I think that sadly reflects upon journalism and where we're at on this question. I think when you look at the mainstream media in this country, for the most part, they see themselves as pursuing capital J journalism, capital T truth, as being the primary objective, and that this is something that can be discernible by an objective foray into a community or a subject, and that these are not questions that journalists should necessarily be concerning themselves with, because their entire MO is somehow objective, and built into the protocols and the ethics of journalism is balance and fairness. So cultural appropriation is something to report on, but not something that we're actually even considering being a part of. Unfortunately, as last year's Cultural Appropriation Prize raises, it has only been in the past couple of years, I would say, that the mainstream media is finally beginning to realize that the way that we operate when we tell news in Indigenous communities has a great deal to do, that we need to be involved in the reconciliation project, and that the mirror that we have been reflecting back as the mainstream media to Canada for the past 150 years has often been a colonial mirror that has helped prop up the colonial project and has been anything but objective, has been anything but fair and balanced. And I think it's only been in the past couple of years that the mainstream media as a whole is finally starting to recognize that.
And just quick, because I want to make sure it gets mentioned, it got mentioned off the top because you actually you wrote the book on how to cover Indigenous communities, and so you talk about the practice and the protocol and ethics of journalism. Very quickly, what did you see? How were those questions not being brought in to the practice of journalism in terms of covering a community that you are not familiar with, covering a community that is not your own? Why did you feel the need to write the guide that you did?
What I talk about in the book is a very important distinction, and there's going to be a cultural clash for all journalists when we have this discussion of cultural appropriation, because at its core, every journalist, myself included, because of the prerogative of editorial independence, which is a hard-fought battle. The freedom of the press is something that any journalist will stand up and march to war over. It's something that is in the Constitution of this country. And so editorial independence is critical to every working journalist. But what that means, ultimately, is that every journalist, myself included, who goes into a community is not necessarily a storyteller, they're a story taker. And that's a problematic relationship. That is the essence of cultural appropriation. It's what we're talking about today, which is theft. That's what cultural appropriation has been, and Indigenous communities have experienced theft of their stories, of their art, of their clothing, of their songs, of their bones, of their blood. That has been the experience of Indigenous communities in this country. And unfortunately, journalists are continuing to do that today. So the important thing that when you say I write the book, what I witnessed was journalists going in to Indigenous communities, asking to tell their story, and then taking that story over and telling it through a narrative lens that was fit the means of both the Canadian news consumer and the way that the Canadian news media has always told stories, without any recognition of how Indigenous voices wanted themselves to be portrayed. And that's why I felt it was incredibly important that journalists start to understand the cultural protocols that they need to operate in Indigenous communities in a good way, as we say in the Indigenous communities.
Thanks. So Jani, you very helpfully began by giving us the history and the background of appropriation within theater and the arts community. In the course of your career, have you seen change or an increasing awareness around this question of appropriation? Are the conversations getting smarter, nuanced, more thoughtful?
I think we're still on the discussion level, but the practical application of it has, we have a lot of work to do in that particular area. But just kind of ripping off of what Duncan's talking about too, what I'm finding in theater now, what I'm finding in theater and in film and in music is that Indigenous people are feeling more comfortable with getting back to recognizing the way that we work. We work differently. We create differently. The way we collaborate is different. And within theater and film, there's these established, in terms of a Western construct, there's I call them the square boxes. It's like, here's the designer, here's the director, and there's a little layover, but it's just these square boxes, and the parameters around it are so rigid. And what I'm finding, especially in terms of collaborating, like I had the great pleasure of working with Duncan's daughter Sam as a costume designer for a show that I directed at Factory last year called The Monument. And it was so refreshing. It was so wonderful to be able to sit in a room and just not have to explain everything, you know, and just there's a dialogue and there's an understanding that you don't have to go into. And there's also the way that I like to work as a director. I don't look at those boxes the same way. There's a lot of collaboration in the way that I look at directing and the way that I look at creating theater. And what I'm finding is that from an Indigenous perspective, there's an understanding of what that means and how we can work in that way. But when I'm working with collaborators that are not Indigenous, who are brought into that process, they have issues, actually. It's hard, I'm finding, for some of them, to let go of that idea of the box and go, but this is my territory and you're stepping on my territory. And I'm like, no, we're just working in a different way. We're going to work in a different way. The other thing that I'm finding is that I had an experience recently where a non-Indigenous costume designer came into a project, and I explained very carefully that it was not, we were looking at a historical photograph using some beadwork designs that, that this real woman had used in her performance outfits. And I said, I really don't feel that we should change these, whatever they are on there, what the choices that she made, how she made them, I don't know, but I don't have the right to change them. And it's not just me. I have a whole community behind me. It's not just my decision, it's the whole community that I also speak to and for. And you know, we had some difficult discussions because she felt that I was encroaching on her artistic freedom. And I had to, again, you know, explain that that reappropriating the images is not something that I'm comfortable with. And it became this really difficult discussion about where does artistic freedom begin and end, especially when we're looking at using indigenous imagery and incorporating them into costume design. Mm-hmm. And trying to honor, from my perspective, the way that things are done in those communities. And in that particular instance, it wasn't my community either. So I'm trying to honor the way that those, and I've spent a lot of time outreaching to different Cheyenne and Cherokee and Chickasaw people to try to get some resources and some people from the community that could speak directly to those issues. But that is going to change the way that we are working now. And what I'm asking in terms of my potential collaborators who are not Indigenous is to create more space, allow more space for the fact that this dialogue needs to take place, not only from an artistic point of view, but with the community that stands behind me. So our whole way of creating is inherently different, and it needs to be looked at differently moving forward. I can only collaborate with people who are willing to give me that space. I can't collaborate with people who come in and say, yeah, I'd really like to work on your project, but this is my box and you're not allowed in there. Because that's not something that I'm interested in doing. Then it doesn't allow me to speak for the community that I also either am representing in the creative project. But I also learned a lot in this last project, a play that I just wrote called I Call Myself Princess, and going back to music, and maybe Duncan can speak more to this, but the whole music ethnology aspect of the wax cylinders and the things that Jeremy Dutcher is doing in his amazing recordings, and the whole history of the taking of those songs without permission. Like, for example, there's a song that Frederick Burton, as a music ethnologist, recorded from an Indigenous community. That's all he says, an Indigenous community. No name, no location, no nothing. Charles Wakefield Cadman took that song and put it into an opera that played at the Met. I was taking Charles Wakefield Cadman's music and putting it back in my play, but I wanted to find the source of that original song. I wanted to find out where that original song came from. And that's really, really hard for me to do, because when Frederick Burton took that song, notated it and recorded it, he did not write down whose song that was and who was the person who actually recorded it for him. It's just an Iroquois melody or an Ojibwe melody. But what we forgot, and what he forgot or refused to look at, was that we have Indigenous copyright law systems. We have those systems in our communities. We have copyright in terms of songs, and are they family owned, are they community owned? All of that was blatantly disregarded when the music ethnologist came in and recorded all of that music. All of those songs became the property and the copyright under white copyright law. And we lost access to all of those songs that were ours originally. And that was because that there was a blatant disregard for the laws that we already, and I'm calling them laws, it was a system. It was a respect, it was an honor that we had inherent in the way that we worked. And now what we're trying to do is to re-engage with what I'm calling Indigenous copyright law, and bringing it into the theatrical, the screen-based media work that we do, the visual art that we do, and saying this is important. We have to go back to those original ways that we worked, and we have to honor our communities by doing so. So my work that's already been 2 years is ongoing in terms of trying to find the original source of that canoe song. And I'm just going to keep going until I can find somebody who goes, yeah, I remember that song, or, oh, Joe down the street might know, you know, because that's where we're at right now. Yeah. But the aspect of collaboration is complicated, and I will, if I can, hire Indigenous people first. But if I am collaborating, it has to be someone who is willing to give space. And my other request is, and my question to them always is, what are you willing to give up in order to be a part of this project? Yeah. Because I want to know that they're willing to give up something in order to be a part of the story that I want to tell.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. This is sort of a perfect segue over to you, James. You recently wrote an essay reflecting on your 3 decades of filmmaking and journalism in Indigenous communities, and you talk about the power of collaboration. So can you talk about your process of collaborating then? What has been a model for you of a collaboration that has worked well?
Well, back when I started the company, Tamarack Productions, I came up with a concept for a series called As Long as the Rivers Flow. And it just seemed obvious to me, based on having seen the work of people like Gil Cardinal, that I wanted to work with people like that. I didn't know him, but I contacted him, and he wanted to be involved. I think that it's very important to be curious, to listen carefully. Between filmmaking and journalism, I've had the great opportunity to be in Indigenous communities, literally from the Yukon to Labrador. And I've received a heck of a lot more than I could have given back. The collaborations with René Siwi-Labelle, both in English and French, a Wendat camera person I work with frequently. He's a member of a group of people that the Canadian government decided by 1920 had disappeared. Clearly, the Wendat are still among us, and René and his compatriots did not disappear. Jani sang on the soundtrack of a film that I made about Duncan Campbell Scott. Gil produced me. I directed a couple of episodes for films that Gil's company directed. He hired me as director. And Loretta Todd, who's currently making her first feature, brilliant documentarist based in Vancouver, worked on As Long as the Rivers Flow. And these relationships, in one way or another, have continued and flourished. Fortunately, Gil's no longer with us, but I still continue in various ways to work with many of these people and listen carefully to new storytellers that are emerging. Michelle Latimer, Alethea, among others, are people who are telling extremely important stories in documentary right now. And I'm interested in hearing about their process. I think that when you're doing a creative work, when you're working on a documentary, when you're publishing something, when you're producing a radio program, and I've done all those things, if everybody is of the same mind, the work will suffer. I think that creative tension is important, and it's usually a good thing when a creative team has people from different experiences coming together. And random stuff happens, serendipitous stuff happens, and the storytelling process has to allow that to take place. But we have to do it in a context of being aware that appropriation, misappropriation, intellectual property theft, respect, curiosity, all these things have ethical dimensions that any storyteller constantly has to be attuned to. And certainly being, I hope, more sensitive to those issues is one of the things that I've gained from working with my Indigenous collaborators.
Mm-hmm. Duncan, I want to ask you about collaboration in journalism, but before I go there, you know, one thing I'm you know, conscious of as we talk about things like, you know, Jani mentioned someone talking about artistic freedom, free press. I think one of the things that we have to acknowledge is that Indigenous communities had their language outlawed, taken away. That there's also the fact of you know, many journalists in Canada are not telling stories in Indigenous languages. They're telling them in English and French. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of language even in this conversation, the access to one's language and what that means in the context of this question of cultural appropriation.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, this country has a long way to go when it comes to what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recognized was one of the key aspects. I mean, the residential schools were fundamental in terms of depriving us of our language, and the many, if not most, of our Indigenous languages are teetering on the brink. There are many, many Indigenous people, and non-Indigenous people for that matter, in this country who are keen to try to revive the languages, and that is something that myself included, I'm going to language classes myself. Anishinaabe, but I don't speak very well, but I am learning. But we don't have, Indigenous audiences for the most part don't have that opportunity to hear their stories and their media in their own languages. There have been efforts at APTN which are admirable, and there are small portions of the CBC in the north which broadcast in Indigenous languages. But it just simply hasn't been an opportunity that many of us have had grown up.
Mm-hmm. So then on this question of collaboration, because, you know, journalism is in so many ways a team sport, have you had experiences of, or I guess maybe what's your take on what is a positive collaboration or a collaboration that can be effective when it comes to this question?
As I listened to Jani and James, I think two words pop out to me. And the words are responsibility and relationships. And I think that's the key portion of, not just for journalists, but for anyone involved in the task of storytelling, is to understand that it is all about relationships. Anyone here who has ever been in love understands that relationships aren't always easy. Relationships are built over a long period of time. That compromise is sometimes required, that sharing is required. And that is the same way that journalists should approach their journalistic sources, as far as I'm concerned, to understand that it's not a one-way street, that once someone agrees to consent to an interview, that the relationship continues after that. After you stick your microphone in their face and it goes into your recorder or your video camera, the relationship continues. It continues ongoing until when that piece is broadcast, but then after the piece is broadcast as well, that you continue to have a relationship as this story will take on a life of its own as it goes out into the world, and that you as the journalist or as the storyteller have a relationship with the sources and the people that shared that story with you. So when you agree to be a storyteller, you have a responsibility then to the community about how this story will be shared and told and the impacts that it will have. Unfortunately, not enough journalists in this country understand that responsibilities and relationships are key to the process of reporting in Indigenous communities. And the problem becomes about two other words, power and privilege. And that is where many journalists just don't see themselves as representing power and privilege, when in fact, unfortunately, they do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, earlier you raised that point about objectivity, and I was thinking, one of the things that came across to me in Connie Walker's work on her two documentary podcasts, particularly in Finding Cleo, the second one, where she actually is very transparent in her reporting and will stop sometimes and say, "This person told me something. I'm actually not sure if I should. I want to pause here because I don't know if this is my story to tell, or I want to wait." And to me, I thought it was a really wonderful lesson in how to do journalism in an objective way, by being transparent about the moment-to-moment ethical choices a journalist makes in, is this mine to tell? This is another human being. What is the consequence if I were to write this down, even though it's on the record? And I'm wondering if you could talk again about the value of having Indigenous reporters in newsrooms telling stories within Indigenous communities.
Connie's work I admire a great deal, and it's a really astute observation that you made about transparency. It's also important to be transparent with our subjects, particularly vulnerable subjects. And I don't think that journalists are always aware of how important it is to explain what it is we're doing. Not everybody understands the medium that we work in, the timelines that we work under, and the so-called angle that we may have when we're reporting a story. It's really important when we work in Indigenous communities to explain that to people, to be transparent about who we are and where we come from. That's what Indigenous people, when an Indigenous person walks up to another Indigenous person, they say, "Where are you from?" That's the first thing they want to know. And when they ask you that, where are you from, what they want to know is not only what part of the country you live in, they want to know who your relatives are. They want to know who you're connected to, where your family is from, and more importantly, they want to know if you know where you're from. And in the same way, we as journalists need to be transparent about who we are, which is part of sharing where we're from. And I'll give you an example. Connie, myself, and several other fabulous journalists at CBC reported on missing and murdered Indigenous women over the course of a couple of years. I noticed in the course of that coverage that unfortunately many times I was hearing that our missing and murdered sisters were suffering abuse at the hands of Indigenous men. And that was a story that was not being covered as much as I thought it should be. So I knew of a men's circle in the city of Vancouver called Warriors Against Violence, where men are learning to unlearn the behavior that they have with regard to women. I went to the organizers of that circle and explained the reporting that I had been doing without a camera, explained the type of reporting that I was doing, who I am, the kind of story that I hope to tell. They said, "That's really good. We'll share that with our brothers." They invited me back to a second circle, which I went to without a camera, and I explained to the larger group what it was that I wanted to do. And again, they made a decision on their own without me there. They had an opportunity to ask me questions. They decided that they wanted to participate in that story, and then we spent days filming with them. These gut-wrenching stories of men, Indigenous men, who are trying to come to grips with the fact that they beat their partners. that they often have been extremely violent with their partners and that they want to change. They decided that they wanted to share that, not just with me, but with the rest of the country. After that story went to air, they asked if I would come to a sweat lodge, which I agreed that I would do. I couldn't do that before. I felt that that would be perhaps a complicated relationship to enter into with this group of men, to go into a spiritual ceremony with them while I was in the midst of reporting on a story where I was at arm's length from them, necessarily. I was not their brother, although I am certainly spiritually, but in this context, I was a reporter. But after the story went to air, I went and had a lodge with them. And again, transparency is one part of it. Accountability is the other part of it, which is it's all about relationships and understanding that these are not, 5-minute, 10-minute, how do you feel? Cry, please. Thanks very much. Bye. I'm Duncan McCue, CBC News, Toronto. I mean, that's, that these are long-standing relationships.
Thanks. I'm going to open up to the floor in just a few minutes, but I want to have another pass with these three. We are here at the invitation of the Center for Free Expression. So I want to get into the question of free speech and what it means to each of you. James, I'll start with you. When it comes to telling stories, are you a free speech absolutist?
I hope I'm not an absolutist in anything. I think that these are extremely difficult questions in this country right now when it comes to stories that are being told of the Indigenous experience and with Indigenous communities and relationships with Indigenous storytellers. And I think that there's danger of absolutism from many quarters. And I don't think there's a magic pill, and I don't think there's a particular formula that's going to work for all stories under all circumstances in all parts of the country and in all communities. I think one has to listen extremely carefully. And I think that people do amazing things. Storytellers are, I'm always amazed at the stories that people can come up with and the ways that they find to tell them. All my storytelling sisters and brothers from various communities. Who would have thought that a young Mohawk guy in the 1950s would become one of the greatest channelers of the tradition of the Delta blues and Appalachian music and work with people like Levon Helm and Bob Dylan. I'm talking about Robbie Robertson. Who would have thought that a young woman named Anderson from Medicine Hat, Alberta, would end up having relationships with people like Herbie Hancock and Wayne Shorter and make one of her most astounding pieces of music, a tribute to Charlie Mingus. I mean, Joni Mitchell is a genius. Storytellers do amazing things. And I'm concerned that, I was listening to Rita Corbière, an elder from Wacomico, just yesterday, and hearing her talk about how moved she was by the feature film Indian Horse. The Indian Horse is based on a novel by Richard Wagamese. He was an executive producer on the film. But in some places, the film is being criticized or considered to be less than legitimate because it has a non-native director. Well, that's not the way Rita Corbière, who attended the residential school in that location for girls, not the boys one, but that the film is about, that's not the way she saw it. So I think that, I said it before, but randomness and serendipity and, the constitutional prospection of free speech. These are not things that we can easily dispense with, but we have to think about the colonial experience of Canada, and we have to think about the unfortunate écart, discrepancy between access of opportunity and quality of storytelling in this particular aspect of Canadian experience and Indigenous people, because for at least 100 years, and to some extent continuing, it was the business of Canada to see that this didn't happen. So, you know, my admiration for people like Jani and Duncan is boundless. There's a hell of a lot of work to do.
Jani, you talked earlier about, you know, the framework in theater, the boxes, and I'm wondering if you can, you know, speak to this question of free speech and artistic freedom, because it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that what you're talking about is actually kind of changing the framework in which we have these conversations, the kind of individual right to, I have my freedom of expression, and, you know, you talked about responsibility. So I'm wondering if you could talk about how does one change the framework and the paradigm, you know, in which these conversations about free speech, free expression, artistic freedom take place.
Yeah, I got so much to say. My God, I want to go. Okay,
I mean, say whatever you want to say. You don't have to answer my
like,
question.
wow, how long do we have? Yeah. Are there snacks? That's all. Okay. All right. I just have to go back a little bit. Sorry. I had to go back because, in the Indigenous community, we've always had our own theatrical. We've always had our dances, our songs, our theatrical. Like I'm not from the West Coast. But I look at potlatches like our operas. You know, we've always had our own theatrical expression and the way that we express our theater. We've always had our own theater. And then what happened, of course, with contact and the assumption of superiority is that we then could only create theater within the confines of the box that we were expected to work within. So many performers, especially from the turn of the century and even today, are constantly having to navigate, should I work on that film? It's not a native director, but you know, I really need the money, it's an important story. So from the other side of that, as a performer, we're constantly going, oh my God, like I turned down 2 Pocahontas films in the early 80s, late 80s, early 90s, and it kind of like crapped my career out with the casting director at that point, who couldn't understand why I would say no to this work, and the agent that I had at the time. But it's constantly what we're navigating. And performers like Tayada Fisher and Molly Spotted Elk and the Wild West Show performers, they had a choice to make. If they didn't agree to the terms and conditions in terms of what regalia they could wear, or that they had to wear regalia. You know, there was virtuoso violinists who wanted to wear Elizabethan dresses or, you know, beautiful gowns, and they were told that they had to dress up like an Indian in order to perform for parlors and women's groups and such. And so, you know, we're constantly faced with navigating this choice that we have to make. So I want to tell a really quick story, and then hopefully I'll get back to your question. Oh my God. I'm just thinking of Conspiracy of Silence, which was, it was supposed to be the story of Helen Betty Osborne. But it was written by a non-Indigenous person. It was directed by a non-Indigenous person. There was no Indigenous people in the crew, and it wasn't really the story of Helen Betty Osborne. But many of us worked on that CBC miniseries because it was an important story to tell, even though it wasn't really Helen Betty's story. It was more the story of the 4 guys. And so Frances, who was directing, there was a number of Indigenous women, Monique Mojica, Michelle St. John, and I actually created Turtle Gal's performance ensemble out of that experience, because the night before we were supposed to shoot the next morning, Frances came to us and said, so here's the rewrites for tomorrow. Can you just translate this into Indian language for tomorrow's shoot? And we were like, no, first of all, and then he said, well. And then we were like, well, no, because Helen Betty was Swamping Cree, she was from Norway House, she was like, that's a whole dialect, none of us we've lost our languages, we can't do that. And then he said, well, isn't there some sort of generic Indian language that all Indians would understand? And we went, you know, like, no. And that was when, and so we asked, we said, well, why isn't there somebody from the community, from Norway House, from her community that you've asked, or as a consultant, can you phone them? Can you do anything? We'll stay up all night, we'll learn the language, we want to do it, but you need to give us some help here. And they said, well, we actually never talked to anybody from the reserve. So the reserve's literally like it's a bridge. You could walk across the bridge from the PA, Manitoba, and there's Norway House. Like, it's really literally across the bridge. They never walked across the bridge. And one of the things we realized was that they were afraid. They were just afraid. They were afraid, that, well, I don't know what they were afraid of. I'm saying, we felt that they were afraid. And the other thing that we felt that they might be afraid of is the fact that that community might say, no. No, we don't want you to tell this story. No. Helen Betty's mother was still alive. Nobody friggin' called her. Nobody said, can we do this story about your daughter's murder? Nobody called her. And I was like, wow, what is that, right? So I'm trying to segue back to your question, sorry. Square boxes.
Yes.
Yes.
Square boxes.
No. The word no. If, partly for me now is, we are finally getting to a place where Indigenous people, we are standing up. We are saying no. We are taking back what is rightfully ours to do, which is to tell our own stories. And there's two things that are really important around that word no for me. One, we have the right to say no. We don't want you to do that story. We would like to do it. And the other part of no is, no, you can't tell that story. No, you can't. Like, you come to us, I've had it's great, the resurgence of the interest in Indigenous stuff, it's all fantastic, it's really good. I see my daughter growing up in a whole different environment that I couldn't have even imagined what's happening now. It's so exciting, so interesting to see our young people feel hope. That's really inspiring for me. But the other side of it is I've got like the last 2 months, I've had like 5 writers send me scripts going, well, if you'll just put your name on this, then I can probably, and I'm like, no. So I have the right to say no on two levels. I have the right to say no, I don't want you to be involved, and I have the right to say no, you can't tell that story. And that's a hard word for people because we weren't allowed to say no, and we weren't asked either. Really quickly, though, I do want to say that the complication of this whole conversation is that what I also discovered in all of my research is that some Indigenous people from the turn of the century to about the 1960s, when we started to really started to go, oh no, wait a minute, we have to stop giving things away, is that there was a sentiment that and there was a belief system inherently in some Indigenous people that we were a dying race. And so, in fact, some of the stories and some of the songs and some of those things were actually given away with the hope that they would be preserved, because they really did believe this sentiment at the time of manifest destiny that we were going to be distinct. We were distinct, that we were going to be, that we were a dying race. And so the hard part for me about cultural appropriation too in the subject matter is that with that sentiment, some families, some communities, some individuals, some performers actually gave away their songs, their stories, because they thought that by doing that they would be preserved. The complication with the music ethnology is that the very people who stole those songs also preserved them. Jeremy Dutcher wouldn't have had access to those wax recordings had they not been wax cylinder recordings made. My argument to that is that we shouldn't have been in a position to have had to give them away in the first place. But no is an important word for me now, and I think that in terms of the squares versus the circles is that in the way that I would like to work moving forward with Indigenous filmmaking, Indigenous theater, Indigenous music, is that if we put those circles over the boxes, that means that we have to, and that's why I go back to that question, what are we willing to give up in order to make this project happen? Because those lines we have to look at the way of working differently now. This is not a compartment. This is not just my job. And that if we work in a circular fashion in terms of creating works of art, of theater, of music, of puppetry shows, whatever, then we need to make space and shift over our perception of what those square boxes are, and that's what we're trying to do in the Indigenous sector.
Thank you. Duncan, the last word for you, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor. I want to sort of just circle back to this idea of free speech too, because each week you host a national conversation. And I'm wondering if you could talk about what you've learned from, opening the floor to the country to debate the issues of the week, in how we might talk to one another freely but with respect and compassion. I'm wondering what you've learned about how we have conversations with one another.
I think it's essential that we have conversations with each other, and not only conversations, but that we have dialogue with each other. That's something that's not happening increasingly because of social media, because of an algorithm, frankly, that is pushing us into our own the sphere that we feel most comfortable in, the sphere that we want to be in. It's not even something that you have to fight the algorithm to try to get the other point of view now. And so, which is why I think cross-country checkup is so essential, because it not only is an opportunity for Canadians to talk to me and to the rest of the country, but it's a really important opportunity to hear other Canadians, and we had conversation with folks earlier on. It's not always easy to hear those opinions, but I think it's critical that we at least hear what other Canadians are saying, because that's how dialogue happens. I often have young journalism students come to me who are very concerned about this issue of appropriation, who are very concerned about whether or not it's their story to tell and whether they should be reporting on Indigenous news at all. That concerns me a great deal, that a young non-Indigenous journalist in this country would feel like it's not a news story that they should be telling. My goodness, I say to them, please, we need to tell these stories to Canadians. You need to tell these stories to Canadians. Even if, and it's important to understand that Indigenous journalists are not represented in newsrooms at equity right now by a long shot. We have a long way to go in terms of hiring more Indigenous news reporters. But even if we get to equity of some sorts, let's say 5%, that still means 95% of the journalists in the newsroom are going to be non-Indigenous. And to expect the Indigenous journalists in the newsroom to be the only ones who are telling stories about Indigenous, that means that vast parts of Indian country, as we call it, won't be covered. We need to have non-Indigenous journalists telling Indigenous news. They need to understand and be trained properly on how to cover Indigenous news, to understand the history of the people that they're covering, to understand the cultural protocols of the people that they're covering, to understand Indian time. And if they begin to understand Indian time, which is about costs, it's about relationships, it's about doing business in a different way that the newsroom is not accustomed to doing. All of this means a paradigm shift that needs to happen, and I think it's what Jani is talking about. It just happens to be in the context of my field, journalism. But I do think it's absolutely critical.
Thank you. Thank you so much, all of you. We have a bit of time to open this up to the floor. So if anybody, and there's a mic over there. So if anybody wants to raise their hand, ask a question, and we'll bring the mic to you. Over here.
and nothing is free.
You raised that. I have a small graveyard of stories where people told me no, that I go and I pay my respects and I say, oh, but you know, when you're absolutely right about people saying no, and sometimes you just have to say okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I agree.
All right. Thank you. I'm Huli McLaughlin. I very much appreciated what you had to say tonight, and I'm very moved by the discussion of a paradigm shift as you ended on, and that was the discussion all the way through. I do have a question. It has to do with the issue of freedom of expression. Notwithstanding the fact that you said, Duncan, that you would have people who are not Indigenous telling stories, you're aware of the fact that a great deal of the discussion revolves around who has the right to tell the story. And a great deal of the discussion has been about that tonight. So I'm going to refer to an episode that happened last year, which it refers to the 1862 war in the United States with the Dakota. At the end of the war, the U.S. Army hanged 38 Dakota men. That was commemorated by the Walker Gallery in Minneapolis last year in 2017. Sam Durant, who's not Indigenous, created a sculpture for their sculpture garden. There was a protest by the local Dakota saying it was not his story to tell, and that the proper procedures, the paradigm hadn't been properly followed. They destroyed the leader or the CEO of the Walker Gallery, had the sculpture taken down and destroyed. Now, I would maintain that. My perspective is that the Walker Gallery had every right to listen to the Dakota people, just as they had the right earlier to try to do something, but they had the right to listen and to destroy the sculpture. It's perfectly valid in the world of art. But I would also say that Sam Durant had the right, as an artist, to not be polite, to not have changed his paradigm, to not listen to you, and to create freely, and to do what he had to do for himself. So my question to you is, how do you respond to the fact that not everybody wants to listen to your change of paradigm? They may very well think that they have their own way of handling it. What happened is fine. Sam Durant himself said, I'm sorry, I didn't fully appreciate, but nevertheless, he's not going to change his ways. He's an artist. Now, I think many of the things you're talking about are not really about freedom of expression. They're about the desire for politeness, responsibility, and humanity. But those are not elements that guide the artist.
Okay, sorry. So the question then is sort of what is the response to the right to create art that might offend or...
What is your take on the fact that I would maintain that you're not fully appreciating that freedom of expression?
Sorry, can you, just a question.
The question is, how do you respond to what happened last year in the Walker Gallery? And do you think that the artists have the right, do you think personally artists have the right to be impolite to you?
Okay.
Do you
want to respond to that?
Do you want to?
Does anyone want to leap in on this one? You also don't have to answer the question. You can...
Well, you know, the challenge here is that the idea of impoliteness has kind of been going on for a few centuries already. So, you know, the whole... I had a really difficult conversation because I think what Duncan's talking about is that these are conversations that need to happen that are just beginning, really, and they're not going to be easy. The conversations are hard. And the shifting of paradigm is hard because it requires all of us to make more space. And it requires all of us to change our minds. And it requires all of us to be more open for listening. That, to me, is the key. So if an artist feels that they have the right, my question back to them would be, did you have a conversation? Were you open to listening? Did you consider what this would mean for other people? Were you able to then take that conversation and put it into your work? It's the lack of willingness to have the conversation, and the dialogue, and the deeply difficult and disturbing dialogue, which is hard for me to take. What I find in terms of assumption of superiority is that for so many years, Indigenous people have been required to assimilate and to be white. There has never been in the history of our relationship an incident where it has been required for white people, and not just white people, actually, this is not just a white native conversation, actually, for non-Indigenous people to act Indigenous, to be Indigenous. I would welcome any one of you to come and spend 15 years living on a northern reserve with a boil water advisory. Then I would say, oh, maybe you speak from more of a place of knowledge and understanding. Well, I shouldn't say you're welcome there, because it's not my right to say so. But the concept of that, then I would say, well, that's maybe a deeper understanding of the lived experience that we've gone through, and the difficult aspect of the assumption of superiority that comes along with your question is what hurts the most.
Thanks. Did you want to, James? Did you want to?
I think nonfiction storytelling, and certainly what the kind of conversations that you're talking about, Jani, and the graveyard of stories that one hasn't done. I have such a collection myself. Sometimes no is absolutely what you have to accept, and that's it, and the story doesn't get done. I think there's a distinction, though, with capital A art. I hope there's a conversation, but if we're in a society where art can't offend, that's a problem. Part of the mission of art is to offend some people in some ways. And almost somebody is going to take offense from almost any work of art for some reason. So as a nonfiction storyteller, relationship and consideration and being willing to accept no that's what respect is about. I absolutely think I try and guide myself by that. But I'm not a visual artist, a painter. I'm not someone doing experimental music. I don't know if the same rules apply. So,
and if I could tackle your question this way, I think what you're asking goes to the heart of power and privilege. I mean, when power begins to shift, it's not going to be easy. Nobody likes to have power taken away from them. And the people in the country that have the power right now are going to resist having it taken away, or more balanced. And it's going to get even more complicated when we start to talk about what's really at the crux of the issue, which is land. Changing names is one thing. And so, for the artist who insists that he has a right to tell that art, likewise, there's going to be critique. And it's rightful critique about his place and his voice and his narrative lens that he's making the art. But there should also be an examination of the kind of privilege that he represents and the opportunity that he had to make the art and the opportunity that he had to get into the art gallery in the first place. And so when I go into the AGO now, and I see Anishinaabe Moen on the walls beside every single piece of art, what I am reminded now is the fact that Anishinaabe Moen has not been on the walls of the AGO for its entire history.
Thanks. Anybody else? Any other questions? We have a mic. Up here? Great. Translate, thank you.
So I just want to make sure that I'm understanding clearly, which is why I want to ask the entire panel, as such a distinguished panel of people who've worked in journalism and theater and all these different disciplines, is that for somebody that wants to tell an Indigenous story and include those experiences, what my concern is if one day somebody who is a non-Indigenous artist shows a story that they did a great job of and won an award for it, isn't there an even bigger concern with something like that if they receive a reward or accolades or something for a story that's not really theirs? Could anybody clarify that for me?
Sure. Does anyone want to jump in on that one?
Can I just clarify then? Can I clarify? So a non-Indigenous person is getting an award for telling an Indigenous story? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, so for an Indigenous group, that the story is being told about an Indigenous group, but the person who made the film and won the award, hypothetically, sorry, is not Indigenous.
Gotcha. Wow, you guys really go to the jugular, eh?
So I would hope. Again, I'm going to stick to the premise that I laid out, which is that I think it's important in all kinds of storytelling, not just journalism. But if I was to use my own field, I think it's important that non-Indigenous journalists go and report on Indigenous stories. And if they do such a great job that they get an award for it, great. I do think that the industry needs to recognize and examine how many Indigenous storytellers are within their industry and whether or not they are getting access to tell the kinds of stories that this non-Indigenous person may have had. And so a lot of it, I mean, when you talk to filmmakers, for example, Indigenous filmmakers, many of them have found a funding ceiling. They do not have access to the kinds of decision makers who give grant money to make the kinds of films that they want to make. The people that are financing big films in Canada, and I put big in quotation marks when it comes to Canadian film, because I think all Canadian filmmakers struggle when it comes to getting access to funding. But I mean, it's about who you know and the kind of cocktail conversations that you can carry on. These are and a lot of Indigenous filmmakers have not had access to that kind of funding. And so I think it's one thing for a non-Indigenous filmmaker to go and make an award-winning film, but I would hope that the industry itself is examining the opportunities for Indigenous participation, and if those opportunities don't exist, then there need to be ways to ensure that we are encouraging, embracing, amplifying, expanding Indigenous voices.
I want to add to that Richard for Indian Horse was very clear in his choice of working with a non-Indigenous director. And I, as an Indigenous person, need to respect Richard's decision. He was very clear that that's what he wanted for his film. So I don't agree with the other folks in the Indigenous community that have come forward to criticize Richard's choice. I want to speak really quickly about I can't remember the exact name of the organization, but I think it's the Native and Inuit Women's Film Collective, and they work in a very different way than the industry works down here. So there's a number of women who get together and they make films. they made an amazing film, and I believe it's called Beyond Tomorrow, that was at TIFF, and just an extraordinary film. And they worked with a non-Indigenous woman who had worked with Zacharias Canuck. I don't know how to spell that, sorry. And it was their choice to work with Marie-Hélène. And it was their choice as a group of Inuit and Indigenous and Native Métis women to work with her because they wanted to learn from her. And she brought to them a number of skills that they needed to learn. She brought also to that group an understanding of how they worked. She brought to that group a compassion and the ability to hear the word no. And so it was a great collaboration, but it was the choice of that group of women to work with Marie-Hélène. And it was a great collaboration. And how the industry works then, of course, is that some of the awards for some of those films go to her because she is the executive producer or the producer on the film. But in terms of how those women look at it, and she looks at it within that organization, they were all winners of that award. Because of the way they work. One woman will direct a film, the next film she'll be the costume designer, the next film she'll be set in locations, the next time she'll be making the meals and catering. That's how that collective works in terms of the way that they make films. So it's also how the industry looks at who we give awards to that don't necessarily recognize how Indigenous, and in that case, Inuit women worked collectively on their films. So that's just another thing to consider.
I think we have time for one more, if there's one there.
Yes, my name is Sandy Greer. I worked as a freelance journalist through the 80s and 90s. And much of my work was doing stories across cultures to build understanding. And I also created a documentary film, Soup on Wheels, on the late Blackfoot political cartoonist Everett Soup. And speaking of awards, what was really beautiful was we became very special friends and developed trust through many years before I did his life story. But he won the award. He won a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Native American Journalists Association, who said to me, where was this guy, you know? And he would have been overlooked and forgotten if that story hadn't been documented. And, but I have a question about another reason why I think there is a lot of cultural appropriation. It's more than about power and privilege. I do believe in Western culture there is a widespread loss of spiritual consciousness and therefore spiritual respect for other people's spiritual identities. I believe we're all spiritual beings on this earth, but in Western culture there's such a loss of that understanding that is why something is taken from someone else. For example, last year the controversy about a young non-Indigenous painter using the imagery of Morso, and she was arguing that she was respecting him, sure. But she didn't get it that those were his, that those were his images from his medicine dreams, and it was morally wrong for her to take those images and repeat them. They had nothing to do with her life, her history.
Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but I just want to make sure we have a question.
So the question is, how would be some suggested ways that there could be an education for non-Indigenous people to really appreciate the spiritual respect and understanding, and I feel a lot of us, we just need to go back to our own ancient roots and look at, you know, what holds us in common as a human family, but also our distinguishing spiritual symbolism and so on. So we need to, it's like a yin-yang, it's a both and. So how do we understand where we draw a line so we're not stealing somebody else's spiritual symbology?
Sorry, just to clarify, the question is, how do we better understand each other's spiritual backgrounds? I just want to make sure I understand the question.
Well, it's how to impart that it's not just about the physical plane of power and privilege, but it's about the spiritual realm of not encroaching on other people's spiritual symbolism if you're non-Indigenous.
Thanks. Does anyone want to respond?
I appreciate that thought, actually, because it is definitely, I mean, even my recent experience working with a non-Indigenous costume designer, and what I kept trying to say is, you can't change that symbol because that symbol has spiritual and energetic meaning and power. And if you suddenly decide that you want to change it because you don't like how it looks, then you're not respecting, in fact, what that symbol represents and the energetic power that it holds. And that's why, in my case, I didn't want to mess with anything that, you know, the woman that had, the Indigenous artist who had made those choices to put those images on her headband, I didn't feel I had the right to change them because she made those choices for a reason, and I can't talk to her, so I didn't know what they, and they might have held a great reverence for her, or they might not have, but I didn't want to be the one to say, well, you know, yeah, let's just change it because I like this image better. They do have spiritual power. They are connected with our very rich and beautiful cultural perspective. And that is, I think it's a very good point that you bring up, that has to be considered. It has to be considered because, so in Turtle Gals, when we brought a spiritual practice into our theatrical practice. We smudged before every show, and we put tobacco down before every show. And one of the things that we would do, we would, you know, say to we would invite our ancestors and our spirits in to help us tell the good story and be there be there with us in the evening. But we were very explicit to tell them not to touch the props, because when you invite those ancestors in, they come. And they are part of, I really believe that our storytelling and our theatrical practices and our films embody that energy. And I have to be super careful about, you know, how I also need to be careful and respectful about how I bring those practices into my theatrical practice and my film practice. And so I'm expecting that non-Indigenous people should do the same.
Great. Do you want to jump in, James?
As a documentarist, Sandy, I think that's an incredibly crucial question when you're working in places like the Nass Valley or northern Manitoba and northern Ontario, where I have. And there are certain spiritual practices going on. You know, I am not of the, you know, slam bam, thank you ma'am, this is news, this is current affairs, we're going to get it, we're going to get out. That to me is abhorrent. And in that kind of situation, you have to know what the ground rules are, and you have to be prepared to hear no, and you have to be prepared to hear yes. And you have to just be extremely attuned and sensitive to someone else's culture and someone's way of understanding the universe. I've worked in Southern Africa, I've worked in Palestine, I've worked in Southern Mexico, I've worked in places where there are a number of different ways of seeing reality. And when we needed to use a drum in a docudrama sequence for a film on an Aboriginal issue in Canada, we went to the community and we said, so what should the drum look like? What would be the right drum to float in the water to get this shot? Wouldn't just go to the, you know, Malabars and get a drum. We wanted to know from the people in the community, what is the right drum if we're going to use this in the film. Now, I'm hoping that more and more people are sensitive to do that sort of thing as they're roaming around the country in this moment. But maybe not. You know, I was horrified to hear the assumption of anybody who's allegedly a mature professional storyteller in Canada, assuming there was one Indigenous language. And,
the stories I could tell.
I mean, that's horrifying. So I think that that's a very important question. And if we're going to tell stories well, we have to be very, very attuned and listen carefully.
Thank you to all of you for your kind attention tonight. Thank you to our three storytellers on the stage for sharing with us. I suspect there might be some housekeeping, or can I just say thank you? Please give a round of applause to our panelists and have a good evening.
Thank you, Rachel.